So hello and welcome everyone to this MSSO webinar, MedDRA Coding Basics. My name is Suzanne Shaker or Shaker. Both pronunciations are correct. I will be your instructor for this webinar. And facilitating our webinar today is my colleague Hannah Eaton, who is an MSSO training coordinator. And let's start off with a few introductions. So I am a medical officer with the MedDRA MSSO. I've been with them, this is my second year. And prior to that, I've had about 20 years experience in the industry, mostly in clinical research settings. I'm based in New Jersey on the East Coast of the United States. And to get to know you a little bit more, I do have a few introductory questions. Where are you joining us from today? What's your experience with MedDRA and what primary role or roles you currently perform? You can either join via the QR code that you see on your screen or the paulev.com URL that you see. So let's get us started. So welcome everyone. Nice to see all the pins showing up on the map. And as the pins are coming in, this will also give you a chance to test out the paulev, because for our webinar today, we will have an interactive session at the end where we will show you some examples, walk you through them, and then show you a second set of examples and have you test out the browser on your own and figure out the coding. So a few maybe housekeeping items as the pins are coming in. This webinar is scheduled for 2 hours. The primary focus is an introduction to coding with MedDRA. If you are interested in other topics, we do have a wide variety of webinars offered that you can choose from, including advanced coding and of course analysis with MedDRA. So I'm so happy to see all the pins coming in and welcome everyone from all over the world, whether it's early or late for you. Thank you so much for the time that you're dedicating to this webinar. But for purposes of time, I am going to move forward, although this is a lot of fun to see all the pins coming in. Okay, so if you can give me an idea of your experience with MedDRA, because this is an introductory course to coding, I'm expecting the majority of the attendees not to be very familiar with MedDRA. I am happy to see a couple of folks with a good number of years experience in MedDRA, so thank you for joining us today. Okay, so yeah, so basically the majority are newcomers to MedDRA. Okay, awesome. And then the next slide for the functions you perform. It doesn't have to be your current function. If you want to even include previous functions, and you can put as many as apply to you. So the majority are PV or drug device safety. Welcome. We do have coders. We have folks from medical review or clinical physicians. Glad to see IT folks and stats. Welcome regulatory authority folks, academia, and other. For other, you're always welcome to put in the other specify in the chat, and we'll take a look afterwards to see who are we missing in terms of categories. And it's very nice. It's always nice for me to see this slide because it really shows the adaptability of MedDRA across different functions, different teams. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Okay, so before we get to the meat of our presentation, this is our disclaimer and copyright notice. MedDRA is owned by the ICH. The slides that we are presenting are also owned by the ICH and copyright protected to the ICH. But having said that, with the exception of the MedDRA and ICH logos, this information can be used on your end as long as changes are not made. And if changes are made, they need to be acknowledged and clearly marked, and avoiding any insinuations that the changes you made were endorsed or sponsored by the ICH. The second bullet point is a warranty bullet point, that this is presentation is presented as is without warranty of any kind. And the third bullet point would not apply because we don't have third-party material today. an overview of our course. We will go through a bit of understanding of MedDRA's scope, structure, and characteristics. We will go over coding conventions and the ICH endorsed coding conventions, which are titled the MedDRA Term Selection Points to Consider. We will show you the MedDRA browsers and do a demo of the web-based browser, and hopefully allow you to test out the browser on your end. There are credentials for access within the chat feature of the GoToMeeting panel. So you have that available to you, or if you have your own username and password, you are welcome to access the browser on your end as well. And we'll conclude with some question and answer session. So just to give you a bit of basic of when did MedDRA start. So MedDRA was developed and created and still owned by the ICH. On their website, they offer a short outline of their history, and they describe how different regions of the world had recognized the importance of having an independent evaluation of medicinal products before they are allowed on the market. And in many cases, this realization was a result of a sad tragedy, like the story that most of us know for the thalidomide tragedy that occurred in Europe in the 1960s, where the drug was approved and released to the market before adequate evaluation. It was also sadly used by many pregnant women, thinking it's a safe solution for morning sickness, when in fact it led to just a horrific number of congenital deformities, intrauterine deaths, and early neonatal deaths. Those multiple layers of failures embedded within that story prompted the drive for laws, regulations, and guidelines in the 60s and 70s, and eventually the desire to harmonize these requirements so that the manufacturers who had to be compliant with them were not under a huge financial burden in meeting them. This drive for harmony was pioneered successfully in Europe in the 1980s, and then the US and Japan joined in, which were the original 3 regions of the ICH at the time of its creation in the 1990s. So that harmony that was the aim of the ICH served not only to ease the burden on the manufacturers by unifying the market requirements, this also helped contain healthcare costs and facilitated introduction of new treatments in these unified markets for those in need. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with ICH guidelines and may frequently come across references in your protocols and guidance documents to compliance with ICH guidelines, like the GCP E6, the DSUR, PBRR under E2, and some of which not only reference MedDRA, but also provide you with which level of MedDRA terms should be presented in the line listings and summary tabulations. So ICH also identified early on that for the harmonization effort to succeed, they had to be able to easily communicate with each other and be able to compare each other's data across different regions, different indications, different product types, and across time. And that's where the idea for MedDRA was born, and it became the first multidisciplinary ICH guideline. So it's an M1 guideline. In fact, if you look up our website, and just want to show you real quick, this is the ICH logo on our website, and if you click on the ICH logo, it takes you to the ICH website where you see the work products for the ICH guidelines. You have the Q guidelines for quality, the S guidelines for safety, the E guidelines for efficacy, and then the M guidelines for multidisciplinary. And if you click on that, the first M guideline is in fact the MedDRA terminology guideline. And on the ICH website, you will see the details of implementation status of the different regions of the world. Where in the world is MedDRA implemented and when was it implemented? So that if you are working in that region, if you have a partner in that region, if you are communicating with a regulatory body within that region, you will know which regions have MedDRA implemented. Okay, so going back to the slides, now the next slide becomes a little bit clearer that MedDRA was developed under the auspices of the ICH. The activities of the MSSO team that I belong to are overseen by the ICH MedDRA Management Committee, which in turn is composed of the ICH parties, the MHRA, the Health Canada, and the WHO as observer. So what is MedDRA? So MedDRA is a clinically validated international terminology. So clinically validated meaning that any modifications or additions to MedDRA have to undergo a review by a dedicated and experienced medical team in different therapeutic areas who are experts in MedDRA. The terminology itself is used by the regulatory authorities as well as the regulated biopharmaceutical industry, and it's used throughout the regulatory process from pre-marketing to post-marketing, including data entry, data retrieval, data evaluation, and data presentation. So this next slide kind of shows you the scope of the use of MedDRA throughout the clinical research life cycle. The only exclusion is animal toxicology. So you're not going to see in MedDRA terms used for animal toxicologies, but from clinical phase 1 throughout until post-marketing, you'll see MedDRA in so many different guidelines and documents that many of you are familiar with. So examples on the screen are, for example, the ICSRs, the investigator brochures, the marketing applications, publications, even advertising. So for countries like the US, where it's allowed to have direct-to-consumer advertising, those terms that you hear during the commercial, like this drug can cause this many side effects, all those are MedDRA terminologies. When I think of the scope of MedDRA, so the blue circle, whatever's inside the blue circle is included in the scope of MedDRA, whatever outside of the blue circle is outside of the scope of MedDRA. So when you think about it in terms of, for example, data collection design, data that is already standardized and already can be summarized without the need of MedDRA tends to fall outside of the blue circle. So for example, the type of clinical trial design, whether it's a double-blind, single-blind, a cohort study, etc., those kind of data is easily summarized outside of MedDRA. So are patient demographics. So MedDRA does not collect age groupings or gender or ethnicity. These tend to be collected in a way where they can be summarized. However, there are terms within MedDRA that may reference gender if relevant for a unique medical concept. So the example is, for example, male breast cancer versus female breast cancer would be relevant to differentiate from a medical perspective. So that is available in MedDRA. Age may be included in some medical terms in MedDRA if relevant. So, for example, specific populations where age is relevant include the neonatal conditions, newborn conditions, some elderly conditions, pregnancy conditions. But in general, those kinds of terminologies are not part of MedDRA, nor are frequency qualifiers. So you're not going to see terms like X number of times or frequently or rare. You're not going to see those kind of qualifiers, although the qualifier intermittent may be found in MedDRA. Severity descriptors also are another example of data fields that have their own data collection and data summarization. So you're not going to see terms in MedDRA for severe or mild or moderate, except in rare circumstances, like, for example, mental retardation. The same for types of drugs or types of equipment, types of devices, types of diagnostic products are out of scope of MedDRA. But for example, events related to device use or events related to combination device drug use can be included in MedDRA. So what MedDRA is scoped for standardizing and summarizing categories of terms classified as medical terms and health-related terms. So you're going to see signs and symptoms in MedDRA. You're going to see diseases, diagnosis, therapeutic indications, even when those indications are signs and symptoms or diseases, or even prophylaxis indications. Names and qualitative results of investigations are included in the scope of MedDRA. So when you have an increased lab result or decreased or abnormal or normal, those kind of qualifiers and lab results are available in MedDRA, as are surgical and medical procedures, medical history, social history, family history, medication errors, toxicologic issues, etc. Some folks might ask about social history and say, how come we have social history in MedDRA, and what do you mean by social history? So social history like substance abuse, or if the subject is a smoker, or there's a history of foreign travel, or maybe they lost a loved one recently, a bereavement issue. Those are all related to the medical scope of MedDRA because they can be seen as risk factors, and they can become very important depending on your line of work. Okay, so the structure of MedDRA, the way MedDRA is built, it's a hierarchy system. It has 5 levels, and you can either approach MedDRA from a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach. Each level is subordinate to the one that is above it. So all these LLTs at the bottom, they are subordinate to the PTs above them. And you'll notice number-wise, the most numerous types of terms are the lowest level terms on the bottom of the hierarchy, the LLTs. So in MedDRA version 26, we had close to 87,000. The higher up you go, the numbers contract. So these 87,000 LLTs are subordinate to about 26,000 PTs. Those in turn get collected together that are close to each other and medically relevant to each other within the high level terms, which are grouping terms. So HLT and above are grouping terms, and you'll see the numbers get less and less until you reach the system organ class with only 27 system organ classes for MedDRA. So when you're coding in MedDRA, basically what you're doing is you are selecting one of these LLTs that is the closest one possible to the verbatim that you're trying to code in its natural language. And there could be more than one LLT that is close to or similar to the verbatim you're trying to code. So the LLTs that are similar to each other are considered siblings, brothers and sisters, and they are considered equivalent. So they kind of mean the same thing. They kind of mean the same concept. So for example, if you're trying to code an abdominal pain, the verbatim you receive from the source, from your reporter, it might say abdominal pain, it might say belly ache, it might say tummy ache, it might say abdominal cramp, but they all mean the same thing. So these are all sibling LLTs. They are all brothers and sisters that are equivalent. Some of them may have additional more details, but they all mean the same thing. And so one of these equivalent LLTs is selected to be preferred to all the others to represent this single medical concept. So the LLT that is selected to represent this single medical concept is duplicated at the PT level. Same term, same spelling, same numeric code. So every single preferred term level, every single preferred term at the PT level, you'll see it again at the LLT level. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. I'll show you the list of system organ classes that we have. So in MedDRA, there are 27 total system organ classes, and some of them are very clear cut. They look like body systems, like the blood, the cardiac, the ear, the lung, the hepatobiliary. Some of them actually represent etiology, like congenital or infection or pregnancy, which is the neoplasm, SOC. These are etiological system organ classes. And some of them serve a purpose, like investigations or social circumstances or product issues. Here's an example in our next slide of these 5 levels of MedDRA in one particular term. So if you think of arrhythmia, not otherwise specified, that's what the NOS acronym stands for. You can also think of it as arrhythmia or dysrhythmia. They kind of mean the same thing from a medical perspective. So the one that was selected to represent this group of sibling or relevant or equivalent LLTs is arrhythmia. The same spelling, and it would have the same numeric code as the term on the LLT level. In turn, the PT is linked to a higher level term, and the high level term would be the rate and rhythm disorders not elsewhere classified. That in turn gets linked to a high level group term, an HLGT, which is in this case, the cardiac arrhythmia, and that in turn gets linked to the system organ class, which is the cardiac disorder. So of course, this example is simplified. We're not showing all the possible LLTs, PTs, HLTs, and HLGTs within the cardiac system organ class, but just to give you an example. And you'll notice on the slide that there's an LLT here in red, and it says non-current, other specified cardiac dysrhythmias. So when MedDRA was first created, some of the terms that were used to create MedDRA were brought in from other terminologies like CoSTART and HUART and some ICD terminologies and JART and so on. And they may not all follow the rules of placement of MedDRA. So you will see LLTs in MedDRA that are non-current, and you'll recognize them, as we see in the next slide, with a red box in the browser. So if you see an LLT with a red box in the browser, it means it's a non-current LLT. And non-currency in MedDRA only exists at the LLT level. So even if you have a preferred term and for some reason it's no longer medically valid, or maybe new information became apparent and then it needed to be made non-current, that PT would be first changed to an LLT level and then made non-current at the LLT level. So non-currency only exists at the LLT level in MedDRA. Of course, LLT terms that are non-current should not be used for coding, but they will always exist in MedDRA. They are retained in MedDRA. They preserve historical purposes to be able to retrieve and analyze any older data that you had that may have been at one time coded to one of these LLTs at the time that it was current. LLTs can become current if they are found to be vague or ambiguous, if they became outdated because new information now is available. A lot of truncated LLTs have been made non-current, or if we find that we made an error in spelling, we also make those non-current. And like we said, some terms that were derived from earlier terminologies that were used when MedDRA was created became non-current because they didn't follow the rules for MedDRA term placements. And just like MedDRA can be used for summarization and standardization, it is important for those purposes to have a numeric code in MedDRA. Every single term in MedDRA has a unique 8-digit numeric code, and this 8-digit numeric code does not change. It remains the same regardless of the language of MedDRA that you are using. So if you're using different languages in MedDRA, the same numeric code would be applicable across the board, and that makes it easier to share data across the board. But this numeric code is non-expressive. And what that means is that it won't tell you anything about the term. It won't tell you which level of MedDRA it falls in, whether it's an LLT or a PT. It won't tell you which SOC it belongs to, whether it's cardiac or respiratory. It won't tell you if it's current or non-current. The only thing is that they are assigned sequentially. So anytime a new term is added to MedDRA, regardless of the level, the next 8-digit numeric code that is available gets assigned sequentially. The only difference is really in the numbers is that if it starts with a 1, then it's part of the MedDRA terminologies, LLT through SOCs. And if it starts with a 2, then it's an SMQ, a standardized MedDRA query term. And part of the functionality of these numeric codes is to be used in various electronic submission types like the E2B, as many of you are familiar with. And like we said, these numeric codes are identical no matter what language of MedDRA you're using. So right now we have about 21, I think, published languages so far. This slide has about 32 or so, so more languages keep coming out. And no matter how many languages are released in MedDRA, in this example, the headache has this particular 8-digit numeric code, and it's the same no matter what language in MedDRA you are using. So let's talk about a concept called a multi-axiality concept. And multi-axiality just basically means that a medical concept in MedDRA may belong under more than one system organ class. So typically, the path that a term in MedDRA from the LLT level takes up until connection to its system organ class depends on the site of primary manifestation. So if it's a medical concept that is a GI concept, like a gastrointestinal ulcer, you would expect to find it under the gastrointestinal system organ class. If it's a respiratory condition, you would expect to find it under the respiratory system organ class, and so on and so forth. But there are situations where the same medical concept can belong to more than one system organ class. MedDRA allows for these kind of multiple collections, multiple axial collections, so multi-axial connections in MedDRA, so that if the same term can be linked to more than one system organ class, you as the end user, you have the ability to retrieve it no matter which system organ class it's under. But because MedDRA is intended to be standardized, so there has to be one primary system organ class out of all these system organ classes. And this primary system organ class is selected by the MSSO team when the term is added in MedDRA. So it becomes standardized and it's predefined and it's hardwired in the ASCII files. So the selection of a primary system organ class is predefined and pre-selected for you. As an end user, you do not select what the primary system organ class is, but as an end user, you can filter your data by whatever system organ class you're interested in, or if your particular product already has maybe some safety information that makes you very interested in a specific system organ class, you can filter your data and look at them and analyze them and summarize them by whichever system organ class you want. But when you are presenting a regulator, for example, with your data, you cannot change the primary system organ class. You cannot make changes to the primary system organ class. The benefit of having a primary system organ class avoids double counting. So if the same condition belongs to more than one system organ class, you only see it listed as one time. And that is a very important part of standardization of data presentations. So it's very important to stress that even if your team was able to make changes to the hierarchy in your organization, please do not change the primary system organ class. It's very important. That's a very important point. Okay, here's an example of a multi-axial term. So when you hear influenza, when you think about influenza, you think it's an infection. Yes, it is an infection. It's also a respiratory infection. So it belongs both to the infection SOC as well as the respiratory system organ class or respiratory SOC. But how do we decide what is the primary system organ class? So in this particular example, you see that influenza was routed to a primary SOC in blue here, which is the infections. And the secondary for this particular example was the respiratory. So what drives the selection? So let's move on to the next slide. The selection of primary system organ class has rules that are followed by MedDRA and the MSSO team when we are making additions to MedDRA. Firstly, if the medical concept can only be represented in one system organ class, then of course that system organ class is automatically assigned as the primary system organ class. The PTs that represent diseases, signs, and symptoms, they are usually assigned a primary system organ class based on the site of primary manifestation. So what part of the body would the manifestation of that disease be shown in primarily? That would be the primary system organ class. But there are three main exceptions to this rule, three very important exceptions to this rule, and they really tie into that story of the thalidomide tragedy. So if you think of those poor babies who were born with multiple congenital deformities, some of those congenital deformities may have been in the heart, some may have been in the nervous system, some may have been in the intestinal system. But because the most important thing for us to know for that baby is that they were born with congenital deformities, then no matter what system was affected, we need to be able to collect them all together and amplify them as congenital disorders. So the three main exceptions to primary site of manifestations is the following. It's important for us to know if the product could potentially have congenital manifestations, congenital disorders. It's important to know if the product could have a cancerous result, so it can lead to a cancer or a neoplasm. And it's important to know if the product could lead to infections. So these three etiological system organ classes, they take precedence over all others. So for example, if you have a skin cancer is a condition that affects the skin and it's a cancer. So skin cancer in MedDRA would route primarily to the neoplasm SOC and secondarily to the skin. That way, no matter what kind of cancers may result from a particular product, they're all lumped together. But what happens if a PT links to any one of these three exceptions. So if the same preferred term, the same medical concept can be linked to more than one of these three exceptions, which one becomes the primary system organ class? Well, the order is as follows. The most important one to be summarized would be the congenital, and then in order would be the neoplasms, the neoplasms and the malignancies, and then in order would be the infections and infestations. So for example, if you have a congenital infection, an infection that is present at the time of birth, the primary system organ class in this case would be the congenital, and the secondary would be the infection. So I hope that that kind of is clear, but I know the multi-axiality is always a little bit confusing. So if anybody has questions, please post them in the chat, and I'm happy to address them. Some system organ classes are not multi-axial. So some medical concepts and some preferred terms exist in system organ classes where they only appear in that system organ class, and there are three of them: investigations, surgeries, and social circumstances. And if you think behind why they are uniaxial, well, if you do a lab result on a patient, or an X-ray, or any kind of investigation, that may be related to more than one body system, more than one condition, more than one disease entity, regardless of what that investigation was. Same for surgeries. If the patient undergoes a surgical procedure or a medical procedure, that procedure may be related to more than one disease entity, more than one system organ class, more than one body system. And social circumstances, like we said, they represent sometimes risk factors. It's really hard to make links to all possible system organ classes and body systems that could be related to this particular risk factor. So that's why these system organ classes only appear in these particular SOCs. They are uniaxial, and this is an important part to remember when you are trying to retrieve data that is relevant to a query you're interested in, not to forget about these uniaxial system organ classes. Okay, coding conventions. Let's talk a little bit about coding conventions. It's important to have coding conventions because coding conventions really are written guidelines. They are sets of principles that guide the end user how to be accurate in their coding and how to be consistent in that coding. Because when you have accuracy and consistency, you improve the quality of your data retrieval. So you're really harmonizing your exchange of coded data when you are all following the same conventions. Conventions can address different topics that may need to be clarified to the coder. How do you handle terms that are misspelled? How do you handle terms that are that you receive as an abbreviation or an acronym? What happens if you receive a combination term or a due to concept? Do you have a selection of terms where you always query, like chest pain is a common one? Do you always query that to clarify if it's cardiac or non-cardiac chest pain? So the purposefulness and the use of coding conventions is really important also when you have a team where not everybody has the same background, not everybody has the same aptitude, and not everybody has the same experience. So they end up with choices in approaching MedDRA, and you want to unify how they approach these choices to achieve consistency. Also, MedDRA, compared to older terminologies, has more LLTs and more coding options. That's another reason to have these coding conventions. And even if you are an organization that has an autoencoder and you use autoencoder, you still need manual review or manual coding in a lot of these terms. So you still need conventions. So you can't get away from having conventions. And even with the autoencoder use, there are pitfalls and there are some challenges with use of autoencoder because the autoencoder does not think like a physician, even though it's designed to be able to achieve automated selection of codes. It really does that based on whatever the process is or the program that was designed for it, but it won't understand if it made a mistake. So an actual example of allergic to cat scans in an autoencoder coded to allergic to cats because it was going through the terminologies and it identified similarities between allergy and cat, and it thought it was correct, but it's not. And same for the second example. So an MI in the fall of 2000. the autoencoder picked up on the MI and it thought the fall matched an LLT of fall, but really in the actual verbatim, this was referring to a time of year in the autumn of 2000. So that was another disadvantage of the autoencoder. So even if you do use autoencoder or artificial intelligence for autoencoding, manual review is still needed to catch these kind of pitfalls. Now, the ICH recognized that the need for coding conventions, and especially on a global scale, on an international scale. So they created ICH endorsed coding guidelines, which they termed as MedDRA term selection points to consider. So the reason they're termed as term selection is because really what you're doing when you're coding in MedDRA, you are selecting an LLT term. So coding in MedDRA is a term selection in MedDRA, and they are called points to consider because they're not mandatory, but they are recommended. They are strongly recommended because they do serve the purpose of promoting accuracy and consistency in term selection on an international level. So imagine when you're trying to work in multiple countries with different regulators, the regulators all are aware of these ICH endorsed guidelines. So if you are also following them, that would be the expectation on the regulator endpoint. If you have your own coding guidelines, which also is highly recommended. I mean, I've worked in the industry 20 years. I've never worked in a place that didn't have their own coding convention, so it is highly recommended. But if you don't have your own, or if you do have your own, please take the time to take a look at them and make sure that they are in step with the ICH endorsed guidelines. If you have anything that is different than what the ICH endorsed guidelines references, then please make sure that you have documentation in writing to explain why. So the ICH endorsed guidelines are available on the website. They are developed by a working group of the ICH Management Committee. They are updated once a year with the March release of MedDRA, so coming up soon in a couple of weeks. And the complete versions of the ICH points to consider guidelines are available in 6 languages, but there are also a group of languages where an abridged or condensed version of the term selection guideline is available. So please feel free to look at our website to find the one that you're interested in if you want some other than the English. And of course, they're available on the MedDRA and the JMO websites. So in some cases, in these guidelines themselves, they all know that there are situations where there is more than one way to code a term. If there is more than one way to approach a coding for a term, the ICH guideline, the PTC guideline, will tell you what the preferred option is. So it will tell you that the committee found that this particular approach is the preferred option, but there is another option to approach this particular kind of scenario. If you have a preferred option, it doesn't mean that you have to always follow the preferred option. But if you choose to not follow the preferred option, one good action is to always document why and have it in your own organizational coding guidelines as reference to your team, but also to external partners and regulators if you get questions about that. The PTC guideline also mentions versioning. Now, versioning is not a topic for our particular webinar for today. There are webinars specific to the topic of versioning, but there are sections in the PTC guidelines that talk to versioning, as well as our best practices document also on our website. So to give you an idea of some of the topics that are covered in the term selection principles or term selection guidelines are the following. Let's go through them all. So starting with quality of source data. So we all know the adage, you know, garbage in, garbage out. So quality of source data covers 2 kinds of source data. When you think of source data, that is the data that you are receiving from your source, your verbatim, so the quality of that source data, and the quality of the data when it gets coded. So the quality of the source data and the quality of the coded data is very crucial to ensure the quality of your output. Ways to approach or think about how you can improve your quality. Of course, you can send queries or clarifications to the reporter if you think that the source data was not of good quality. Not everybody has that option, so depending on what kind of data you're dealing with, you may not have the option of sending out clarifications. Some data comes in through points of collection by staff. So if you train those staff on the importance of the quality of data, if you get them a little bit familiar with MedDRA, it becomes easier for you to code the data coming in. And of course, like we said, creating your own coding guidelines that are consistent with the MedDRA term selection PTC guidelines, having a review being done of your coding by qualified individuals. So many organizations have the step of having somebody sign off on coded data who have a medical background and are familiar with MedDRA. And of course, if you're using the automated coding approaches, to have some kind of human oversight. A very important principle, like we said before, don't change MedDRA. MedDRA is a standardized terminology, right? It's meant to be used as a standardized terminology. If you make any changes to the hierarchy, the predefined hierarchy in MedDRA, then you are no longer using the standardized hierarchy that everybody else is using. So if you have partners, if you are sending information to a regulator, they all expect you to have used the predefined standardized hierarchy. And if you make those kind of changes, you might get questions back, especially from the regulators. So please be very careful not to make any ad hoc structural alterations to the standardized hierarchy of MedDRA. But if you find something in MedDRA that you're not on board with, if you find something that was connected to a SOC that you think was not the right SOC, or going through a hierarchy that you think should not have been the primary hierarchy, we are always happy to receive these kind of requests for changes. So if you think something was not correctly placed in MedDRA, please submit a change request to the MSSO and they all get reviewed. Okay, another principle covered in the MTS, and the MTS is MedDRA term selection, points to consider principle is always select a lowest level term that is current. So of course, non-current terms, like we said, the ones with the red boxes, they are available in MedDRA. They will always stay in MedDRA for historical purposes, but please don't use them when you're coding. And also when you're selecting a current LLT, try to find the one that most accurately reflects your verbatim that you're trying to code, not just in terms of details within the verbatim, but even the order of the words. Sometimes we have LLTs with lexical variances, lexical meaning that the order of the words may be shifted. So you can find myocardial infarction, you may be able to find infarction myocardial, and whatever your verbatim is, code it to the closest match. But also the exact contents of the verbatim may be available in MedDRA. So if you have a verbatim that says abscess on face, right? We do have an LLT of abscess in MedDRA, but MedDRA has a ton of other terms with abscess in them. You have abscess lung, you have abscess cerebral, abscess on the back, abscess in the kidneys, abscess in the liver. So if your verbatim has a specified location for the abscess, you might be able to find that in MedDRA. And in MedDRA, the abscess on face does not exist, but facial abscess exists. So when you're looking for terms in MedDRA, another thing to think about is, are you using a stem of the word or part of the word? Because if I put in abscess and I put in abscess and face in MedDRA, I'm not going to be able to find it. But if I put in abscess and a stem of the face, if I put in FAC instead of face, I'll be able to find abscess facial. So just something to think about when you're looking in the browser. And of course, like we said, don't select non-current LLTs. They will stay in MedDRA just for legacy purposes and historical purposes, but not for use in coding. Okay, so when do you send a change request to the MSSO? So if you're working in MedDRA and you're finding that you end up using a workaround because you can't find a specific term that you're interested in MedDRA, or one that is equivalent to it. You can't find an equivalent medical term to the one you're interested in, and you find yourself always having a discussion and a workaround, then that kind of example is one that really should be submitted to the MSSO for addition to MedDRA. because if that's a valid medical concept and you just can't find it, but it can be referenced, there's research on that medical concept, it doesn't exist in MedDRA, please submit it as a change request to the MSSO. Now, if there are medically equivalent terms in MedDRA, but you're not sure which one is the best one for your particular verbatim, then you can use medical judgment, because you have existing terms, it's just you're not sure which one is the most closest or the most adequate to represent your medical concept. Then you can use medical judgment and seek input from maybe members on your team with medical background. Another principle that is covered in the PTC guidelines, when you are coding, you need to ensure that you're coding everything you're receiving in your verbatim. So whether your verbatim was an adverse reaction or adverse event that is related or not related to your product, they need to be coded, right? So regardless of causal relationships, all AEs and ARs need to be coded that are reported. And everything within the verbatim needs to be coded, because if you don't code something that you received, you're not going to be able to retrieve it. It's not there anymore. You're not going to be able to use it in your analysis or in your standardization or in your representations. And MedDRA is really rich in different kinds of terminologies. So you have device-related events in MedDRA, you have product quality issues in MedDRA, you have medication errors, you have medical history, social history, investigations, indications like we said before. So you have a lot of different types of terminologies in MedDRA. And just like we say, don't leave anything off the table, don't add anything to the table. So don't add information that didn't come from your reporter, from your source term. So when you're coding in MedDRA, you can't make assumptions. So if you receive a verbatim like this one, the report says the patient had abdominal pain, increased serum amylase and increased serum lipase. Maybe the safety physician on your team will look at this report and say, this looks like the patient is complaining of pancreatitis. Let's code this to pancreatitis. You can't code that to pancreatitis. That's not what the report includes. So even the report has a sign and symptom or investigation or a procedure being done for a condition that you think you know what it is. If the verbatim does not clearly specify what the diagnosis was, you can't make the assumption when you're coding. So in this particular example, the best approach for you would be to select an LLT that matches each of these separate terms. So an LLT for abdominal pain, and an LLT for serum amylase increased, and an LLT for lipase increased. And as I said, I am aware that there are users, I don't know on the call today or not, but there are users of MedDRA who don't have the option of splitting. So those are kind of discussions that have to go on internally per organization as to how to handle terms when a single LLT is not enough to cover all the information being received in the verbatim. The PTC document, the MedDRA term selection points to consider document, will tell you what the preferred option is and how to split them up, and split them meaning to assign an LLT to each part of it. But if you are working in a team or working in an organization where the activity of splitting or assigning more than one LLT is not an option, then you have to think about, how do I manage this? Do I need to query the site to report them separately? Do I need to query the site for a diagnosis instead of multiple terminologies? Am I able to enhance terms on my end using brackets or any other way where I can code the same term two different ways? So there are different ways to approach this, but just the understanding that a single LLT term may not be enough to cover the entirety of the information you are receiving in your reported verbatim. The points to consider document really is a large document. It covers so many different topics that we won't be able to go through today. Some of these topics are covered in more details in our other webinars that deal with advanced coding. So if you are interested in that, please sign up for future webinars. But just to give you an idea of what that term selection PTC document covers. So for example, we have death section, we have a combination section. If you have a term that includes both a body site and specific events, how do you approach those? How do you approach investigation terms or congenital terms? And there's more. Medication errors, abuse versus misuse. How about when you have normal terms or no adverse effects? Or how do you approach off-label use? So these are all kinds of areas and scenarios that are covered in the term selection points to consider document. Whether you're new to MedDRA, whether you are experienced coder, if you haven't seen it in a while, it's always good to go back and refresh yourself to the document, especially when you have a term come your way. Maybe you can go and take a look at that particular section of the PTC document that has to do with your example that you received, and maybe you'll find the answer there. So before we go on to the browsers, let me just pause for a little bit and ask Hannah, do we have any questions so far?
We have not received any questions yet.
Okay, great. Okay, let's talk a little bit about MedDRA browsers. So every user in MedDRA has access included in your subscription to 3 different browsers. So you have the desktop browser, the MDB, the web-based browser, the WBB, and the mobile browser, the MMB. And all of them are available to you as a subscriber. They all need to have your MedDRA ID and password to be able to access them. They all enable you to view the MedDRA terms and the SMQs, the standardized MedDRA queries, but we're not talking about SMQs for this particular webinar, but you are able to access them through any of these 3 browsers. You're able to search for terms on any of these browsers in any language that you're comfortable with. So you can actually change the interface language on any of these browsers, and you can look up MedDRA languages in different MedDRA translations on any of these browsers. The mobile browser is the only one where you cannot export search results. So when you're searching up terms, if you use a functionality in the browser called a research bin, both the desktop browser and the web-based browser will enable you to export your search results and filter them in Excel format, etc. But the mobile one does not. And the mobile one, just as an FYI, it's not a, what do you call it? It's not an app, it's a URL. So it's really a URL. You can even access it on your computer if you want to see what it looks like. And it's designed with an interface feature where it's large enough that you can search for it using your smartphone. Okay, so the MDB and the WBB, we said they allow you to export search bin results and to do that kind of review. There's one thing that the web-based browser has that the others do not have, and that's supplemental information. Supplemental just meaning what's coming next. So right now, MedDRA team, the MSSO, is preparing for our March release of MedDRA. So we've already gone through a ton of change requests. Many of them have been approved. So there have been terms that are approved by the international medical officers who review these change requests, and they are happy to add them to MedDRA. You can see them on the web-based browser if you look up the supplemental view. But just to kind of keep you in mind that these are not yet released, the supplemental view will change everything into pink. So if you see it in pink, you'll know that it's not yet released. But all browsers will enable you to view primary and secondary link information, and the MDB and the WBB will enable you to upload your terms and run against SMQs and do advanced search options, like the Boolean options where you specify not or etc. Okay, so I'm going to show you a browser demonstration. As I'm showing you the MedDRA browser, you are welcome to access the browser on your own as well if you want to click along. If you have your own login information, then you can use it that way. If you want temporary login information, they are available in the chat, so you can retrieve them that way. If you're not sure how to find them, you can send the chat to Hannah, and Hannah will be happy to show you. So let me just go to our website. So this is our website again. There's more than one place where you can link to the MedDRA web-based browser. The fastest way is these quick links on the top. So maybe I can also give you just a quick demo of our website. So when you first log into our website, this is our welcome to MedDRA in multiple different languages. The COVID link is right here on our home page, and then you have these quick links on top. So the web-based browser is the link with the WBB. We'll go through this in a little bit. Let me just show you the rest. The SSA, which is the self-service application. If you're not sure of your MedDRA ID or password, but you have your organizational email, you can use these. It's very easy, self-explanatory how to retrieve it. This is also where you can, for example, retrieve your ID or password or unzip password. You can verify a partner subscription status. You can verify who your MedDRA point of contact is at your organization if you're not sure who that person is. And you can retrieve training certificates or links for webinars from this SSA. The PTC guidelines that we just talked about have their own quick link on the top here as well. So once you click the PTC, it will default open or toggle open, this blue ribbon. So this blue ribbon under the PTC has the points to consider document that I just showed you. So if you click on it, you can click whichever format you're interested in, and you can, of course, go all the way to the table of contents and see what section you'd like to review. There's also a PTC document, a points to consider document on MedDRA data retrieval and presentation. We have webinars on that topic as well if you're interested. There's a third PTC document, also ICH endorsed, called companion document. It has a bit more detail in some areas of interest, especially, for example, medication errors. The MedDRA best practices document is a very useful document. It has a lot of information about versioning. So if you have questions about versioning or recommendations about versioning, it gives you 6 options that you can go through and pick the one that best suits your organization. The gray ribbons have the version-specific guidance documents. So there's an introductory guide to MedDRA, there's an introductory guide to the SMQs, what's new in MedDRA, and the distribution file format, which is a little bit more techy with every release. But introductory guide to MedDRA is also a very, very useful document. It has kind of a detailed flow of information about how MedDRA was built, what the hierarchy of MedDRA is, and then, of course, it walks you through a few examples about the equivalence in MedDRA, what we mean by equivalence in MedDRA, how we approach abbreviations and spellings in MedDRA, the word order in MedDRA. It's really full of very interesting information just for the build of MedDRA, and then it walks you through SOC by SOC with a few details about how each SOC was put together. So a really helpful document here as well, and it's released with every version of MedDRA, so it's version specific. Okay, so let me go back to these tabs here on the top just a little bit. The about MedDRA is just a bit about the history, the evolution of MedDRA. How to use tab is I think the one that is most useful to you in terms of finding your support documentations. So if you click on support, let me go back to home just to show you the difference. If you click on how to use and support documentations, this also takes you again to the documents, just like the PTC quick link up here. This takes you quickly to these documents. It also has the link to the change request. So if you want to submit a change request, there's the change request web CR. There's the information about submitting change requests to MedDRA, and it has a link to the tools. So a lot of these tools are outside of the scope for today, but here's the link for the browsers. So you can click on how to use tools and then browsers. And here's the link to open the web-based browser. You can open the mobile browser from here. You can open the web-based browser user guide from here, and you can download the desktop browser from here. The difference between the desktop browser and the web-based browser is that the desktop browser needs to be first downloaded to your desktop. It will have all the features, the operating features as the web-based browser, but it won't have any MedDRA files. So if you do download the desktop browser, the advantage of that is that you can use it offline once it's downloaded and once you have downloaded whatever files you need. But you are the one who needs to determine which MedDRA files you need. And by that, I mean which MedDRA versions and in which languages. So you'll need to download them into the desktop browser. And of course, anytime we have a new release of MedDRA, you'll need to grab that off of our downloads page right here and also download it into your desktop browser. So the advantage of it is that once you have all the downloads, you can be offline. You don't need internet connection to be working in the browser, but you need to make sure that you keep it updated with any release of MedDRA. And of course, the desktop browser won't have the supplemental view. So the training tab, just to kind of finish a little bit about the tabs, the training tab has our training curriculum, and a training curriculum is a really nice roadmap of how you can get more and more experienced with MedDRA. It kind of walks you through, if you're somewhere here where you're just around the basics, what other trainings are available to you that you can follow through and become more experienced in MedDRA. And it gives you these acronyms, you know, if it's a W, it's a webinar, face-to-face or video, and links to each of them. So if you click, for example, our video links, it takes you to our instructional videos, and you can play them at your leisure in any language that you're comfortable in. And of course, the training also has our link to our YouTube channel, where many of our webinars are already posted there. So you can play them back at your leisure in your free time. So let's talk about the web-based browser demonstration. When you go to the login page, right here off the bat, you can choose whatever preferred language you want. So if you want to change your language, you can do it here, and you can also do it once you log in. So when you're in the web-based browser, your input language or your interface language is up here on top. This gray ribbon across the top has your preferences. So you can set your preferences up here. You can choose whichever language in MedDRA you like. So there's a first language with this kind of yellowish or greenish color. Your second language, you can choose up to 3. So let's do Finnish, let's do Korean. So here you have 3 different languages. Their order, the way that they show up, will be in the order from left to right here on the top. So whatever your language is that is highlighted in either yellow or this greenish yellow will show up on top, and then the other 2. And whatever languages you selected here, you'll be able to search up as well here. So you can look up terms in English or Finnish or Korean, right? So whatever languages you chose here, you can also choose which MedDRA version that you're interested in. But if some of these languages are not available in all MedDRA versions, then it won't show you all of the MedDRA versions depending on which language. So let me restore my defaults, keep it at English, and show you now in English. I can go down to 2.1. Okay, this browser view defaults to the system organ class view, which was what you need for coding. But if you change it to SMQ, then you see the SMQs in MedDRA. And that's a topic for another webinar. So let me go back here. And then when you select your release or supplemental view, it defaults to the release, which is whatever the current MedDRA version is. But if you click supplemental, and supplemental is only available in English, everything turns pink, right? So you see everything in pink. And if you want to see examples of what are the new terms, I'm not sure if we're going to find any or not here. So we're not going to find any here. Let me choose a different one. Okay, so if you see terms that have this interrupted box around them, that means that they were newly added to MedDRA to the supplemental term. You can see them here, but you won't find this term under the release view yet, not until it's released in the next MedDRA release, which is now coming up in March. So let me go back to the release view. And then at the end here, you can select whether or not you want to see the numeric codes. It will show you the numeric codes, and whether or not you want to see the non-current LLTs. If you don't want to see the non-current LLTs because you don't want to select them, you can untick it, or you can keep it ticked, whatever your preference is. On the top here are a few buttons that are very useful when you're coding. So when you click MedDRA concept descriptions are not definitions. They are just a description of how the medical concept is used within MedDRA. So it's not a medical definition, but it guides you through how this medical concept was managed and handled and interpreted within MedDRA. So it becomes very useful for you when you're coding. So if you're interested, for example, in abuse, and if you want to select a term for abuse, this tells you, for the purposes of term selection, what abuse is interpreted as in MedDRA. And it's of course alphabetical. So if you're interested in a product, can I use a product to code a drug or a product to code a device? You'll see here that in the context of MedDRA, product can refer to either one. So it can refer to drugs or biologics or vaccines or combination products or devices. So these MedDRA concept descriptions are really useful when you're coding. Let me come back to the legends, just a little bit about that. The new browser window allows you to open a second browser. So if you are looking for a term here and you don't want to lose the view by starting a new search, and you want to start a new search, you can just open a new browser window, and you can do that as many times as you need. The MedDRA documentation is a very useful link, because while you're in the browser, if you want to code, for example, a combination term, and you want to refresh yourself, well, what did the PTC guidelines say about that? You can just click this, and it'll take you directly back to the same area on our website that has all the documents without leaving the browser. So that's a useful feature. You have access to the user guide. So there's your user guide right here. If you want to have more details about what each panel represents, you can have access to the user guide. And then a couple of tools which we'll not be covering here. The SMQ analysis and hierarchy analysis are very useful tools, but we're not going to be covering them in this particular webinar. So let's talk a little bit about this legends, because MedDRA has color codes, right? When you're looking at a color code in MedDRA, if the same preferred term links to more than one system organ class, the system organ class that is primary will have a blue box. So if you see a system organ class with a blue box, that means that that particular system organ class is the one that's primary to that preferred term. But what about the colors for the PTs? So the colors for the PTs really depends on whether the PT itself is a uniaxial preferred term, meaning it's only linked to one system organ class, or multiaxial preferred term, meaning that it's linked to more than one system organ class. So if the preferred term only links to one system organ class, the box will be red. If the preferred term links to more than one system organ class, so it's multiaxial, and you are seeing it under the primary system organ class, the box will be blue. But if you're seeing that preferred term under its secondary system organ class, the box will be green. So I know that this may not have been very clear, so let's see an example of that in this panel, this left panel here. This left panel is your MedDRA hierarchy. So right away you can see all 27 system organ classes. And this panel allows you to drill through MedDRA from a top-down approach. And a top-down approach can be helpful in some areas where you're not sure what to look up, you're not sure where to go. So for example, let's say that you're trying to code a congenital term. You know it's congenital because that's what the report said, that this was a congenital term, but it's a very rare term, and you couldn't find it when you looked it up in MedDRA, you couldn't find it. So now you're thinking, well, is there an equivalent term to it? But I'm not sure where to look. You can drill open your congenital system organ class. And if you know, for example, it's a congenital eye term, so I can open congenital and eye and look through here. Is there a high level term that I think applies to the one I'm interested in? So let's say it's an eyelid term. So I know it's congenital, I know it's eye, and I know it's eyelid. If I open up the eyelid, these are all my preferred terms that are grouped under the eyelid disorders congenital. Is the term I'm trying to code, does it fit any one of these? And if I'm not still sure, I can open up all of these PTs and I can look up all of these LLTs and see if one of them really matches the term that I'm interested in. And as I'm opening up, you're going to see some of them with red boxes because I didn't untick the show non-current LLTs. Some of them are in red boxes. So they're there, but I can't use them when I'm coding. right? So just looking at this, this is a way to go top down when you're not 100% sure what you're looking for. And this is really useful for certain system organ classes, like, for example, product issues. Product issues are really very useful to go top down because there's going to be so many different kinds of of manufacturing issues. For example, is it a material issue? Is it a production issue? Is it a lab control issue? So you can have it that way. And even if it was a medication error, so if you go to the injury SOC, right? Medication errors are somewhere here. There's your medication errors. There are so many different kinds of medication errors. Was it a dispensing error or administration error or monitoring? Or is it a prescription error? Is it during the prescribing process? So there's so many different kind of categories. And this top-down approach is really useful when you're not sure where to get started. Let me restore my defaults and go through those legends that we talked about. So let me give you an example. Let's say hepatobiliary. Let's look at this one. Let's do hepatic failure. Let's do this one. Okay, so there's different colors here for hepatic failure for the preferred term, right? So if the preferred term only belongs to this system organ class, which is the hepatobiliary, it will be in a red box. It means that this particular term, the acute hepatic failure, only exists in one system organ class, and you're on it. You're on that system organ class here. You're on the hepatobiliary. If I click on this particular preferred term, two of my panels will have information on them. So right now, none of these panels had information on it. But if I click on a preferred term, or any of these terms, if I click on any of these terms, these two panels will populate with information. The one on top is really basic. It's telling me where your placeholder is, where I'm at in the hierarchy, so that if I go down and I'm opening up other things and I'm looking, I still know where I'm clicked on. So it's like my placeholder, kind of my reminder where my click is, where my click was last in the hierarchy. But the one on the right, it gives me my term details. Everything I need to know about the one that I'm on. What level of MedDRA it's in. This particular one is a preferred term. What's the code of it? What's the system organ class it belongs to, and the code for that system organ class, and whether it's primary, whether this particular term can be found in an SMQ, and if so, which SMQs? And if it is found in an SMQ, what category is it in? So a lot of details just by clicking on one term here. But if I click on this term, I see that it's only linked to one system organ class. So right here, occurrences in MedDRA, there's only one system organ class. And I already know this because it has a red box. It's a uniaxial term. Well, what about the one with the green box? A green box meaning that if I click on it, it's multi-axial, so it's linked to more than one system organ class. But the one I'm on right now in my hierarchy is not the primary system organ class. That's why I'm seeing it here in the hierarchy with a green box. This particular term, the primary system organ class, as we see here on the right-hand side corner here, is the congenital system organ class. So when I see it in my hierarchy under the hepatobiliary disorder, it will show up with a green box. But if I see it under the congenital system organ class, it's going to have a blue box. The same term, if I see it under the congenital, it's going to have a blue box. So the Alpers disease, so let me open up congenital, and it's under the cytoplasmic disorders. So here's cytoplasmic disorders, here's genetic mitochondrial abnormalities, and here's genetic mitochondrial abnormalities, and it's Alpers disease. So you see it here with a blue box, because even though it's multi-axial, in this particular instance of the hierarchy, I am seeing it under the primary system organ class. So the same preferred term does exist in more than one system organ class, and the color will tell me whether I'm seeing it under its primary SOC or under its secondary SOC. So I hope those color codes now become clear. Now the part that you're going to be using the most when you're coding is in the middle here. This is our search. And the nice thing about this, so let me just get rid of all of these, restore defaults and start fresh. The nice thing about the default options here is that anything I put in my search box here will give me results no matter what level of MedDRA they exist in. So it will tell me whether it found that in an LLT or a PT or HLT or HLGT or SOC level. I can untick them if I just want the LLT. I can untick them and just see the LLT, but I like to see them under them all. So I like to restore my defaults to tick all. If your only language selected is English, you can only look up English, but if you want to look up in a different language, please remember to select it on the top here to allow you to do so. So if I'm looking up an Arabic word and I hit enter, it's not going to find anything because I didn't tell it that I'm going to be looking in an Arabic language. But if I add Arabic here and I don't select Arabic in my drop down, I keep it English, it's also not going to understand what I'm trying to do unless I tell it, I selected an Arabic language up here, and now I want you to show it to me in Arabic, and then it will start looking for findings. And the order will be whatever the yellow language on top, whatever the other language on the bottom. So let me just restore defaults again. It defaults the search to look up synonyms. So for example, and I know this is kind of small, but let me try to make it bigger. So synonyms meaning what? Meaning that if I am looking up epilepsy by using the word epilepsy, it will still give me options for convulsions or seizures. And if I am looking up, for example, hemorrhage, by looking up bleeding, it will show me the synonyms, whether the term itself has hemorrhage or whether the term itself has bleeding. So let's try it out. So let's do, I don't know, let's do generalized seizure. So I put parts of a word, I put GEN as part of a word, and I put seizure. Now, because I don't have complete words, it didn't find me an exact match. So it's telling me 0 for exact matches. And 0 for lexical because I didn't put a complete word. But it found synonyms for seizure, it found convulsions, and it found epilepsy. These are all synonyms for seizure. So it found them for me, and it gave them to me under my synonym search results. It also said I found these combinations together in the following options. I found GEN with seizure in the following options. One of them is psychogenic seizure. So it's not generalized because it's looking for GEN. But what if I'm only interested in words that start with generalized seizure? I can go to my advanced search. So I can go here and say, I want you to begin with GEN, and I want you to contain seizure. And now I'm looking. Now here it's telling me, okay, I know what you want now. I found your term that has GEN in the beginning. So here are the options. And I found whatever seizure is in addition to its synonyms. So I found generalized convulsion, and I found generalized epileptic seizure, and I found, for example, tonic-clonic seizure, etc. So you can fine-tune your search that way by using these advanced search options. Another thing I can do, let's say going back to that congenital eyelid disorder. Let's say I'm not sure exactly how to start looking for my congenital eyelid disorder, but I know it's eyelid. So I'm going to write eyelid and I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to look up enter. Well, there's 239 items that it found, 239 search results. The LLTs alone are 178. I'm not sure where I'm going to start looking, but I know it's congenital. So maybe I just want to look for congenital SOCs. So I'm keeping eyelid and I pick congenital and then I run my search again. Look how fewer results I'm getting. Only 13, but it's reminding me with yellow reminder here that you're only limiting your search to one SOC, which is the congenital SOC, but it found 13 entries with the word eyelid under the congenital SOC. And I can start looking that way. So this is another way of searching just by using parts of the words and by selecting which SOC I'm interested in if I have a lot of results. So I hope that was clear, but if anybody has any questions about the browser, please let us know. But in the interest of time, I want to go back and continue with our presentation. So We're going to go some examples on how you think through the terms when you're finding your best LLTs. You're going to ask yourself, what is the term that I'm receiving? Is it a symptom? Is it a test result? Is it a procedure? Is it a device issue? Is it a combination of multiple things together? So that will help you start thinking, which system organ class do I expect this term to show up under? So here's an example, and you're welcome to try on your end as well. See if you find the same one that I came up with. This is not the interactive session. We're going to have a couple of examples here, just walking you through it, showing you the browser on my end. But then after we're done with these examples, we'll have a couple of examples where the answers are not given, and you'll be the ones thinking about it and giving your responses. But let's think about this one. The patient suffered from an allergic reaction to an antibiotic. So let me go into my browser, right? And let me just restore defaults. So it was allergic reaction. So let's do allergic react and just click enter. So there's 25 of them. That's not too bad. I just want my LLTs because I'm not interested in the other hierarchy just yet. And I'm looking at my possible options here. So there's acute allergic reaction. Well, the verbatim didn't specify it was acute, so I don't want to use this one. There's standalone allergic reaction. And if you open it up, if you click on the plus, it will tell you that this goes to hypersensitivity. Okay, if I click on hypersensitivity, this goes to the system organ class immune system disorders. Okay, that's not a bad option, but do I have something that's even closer to my verbatim? And again, my verbatim said allergic reaction to an antibiotic. I see here allergic reactions to antibiotics. It seems very similar to my verbatim. Does it go to a different preferred term? So let's expand here. And yes, it goes to a different preferred term. And this is very important because in most organizations and regulatory agencies, the preferred term is the one that is used for data display, for data analysis, for data retrieval, and data summarizations. So the preferred term is a very important term. So if it's different between these two LLTs, that tells me that this is the correct response for my verbatim because it's a different preferred term than this one. So allergic reaction on its own, even though it's not wrong, it's not the best one because it's very, very vague, not vague. Vague is not the right description, but it's not as specific as allergic reaction to antibiotics. This gives me a much more detailed representative LLT to my verbatim. So if I go back to my slide and let's find out what the right answer is. Oh, sorry. Allergic reaction to an antibiotic. That would be the best option in this case would be allergic reaction to antibiotics as an LLT. Okay, let's do the second example. Okay, so the patient states she has been experiencing cold sweats. Okay, let me go back to the browser, restore defaults, and start over with cold sweats. And just hit enter or click the search button. I don't see anything. There's 0 results. So what can I do with this particular term to try something else? Maybe take off cold and see sweats. Well, there's night sweats and there's drenching sweats. But are these what my term is reporting? Well, let me try something else. Let me go back to cold sweat and just do it without the S and do it that way. I see it now. I see it as an exact match as cold sweat. So just a reminder that if you're trying to code a verbatim where the verbatim itself may appear as a plural term, cold sweats, one option you can look for is the single of that term. That can help you find more options in MedDRA. Okay, lab results indicate the patient has increased troponin and increased CPK-MB. So let's look for those. So if I restore defaults and look for troponin and just hit enter. So I have standalone troponin. Standalone troponin is an investigation. And I must have other options with troponin. So I have so many different kinds of troponin, right? So I have troponin C, I, or T. My verbatim didn't specify it was C or I or T, so I can't choose any of these. It has to be standalone troponin. So do I have troponin standalone? Does troponin abnormal? Well, no, my verbatim said it was increased. So do I have troponin increased? Yes, I do here. So I have troponin increased. So even though my verbatim had increased troponin, I can't select an increased troponin because I don't have it in MedDRA, but I have troponin increased, and that would be the best option. So in my current verbatim, this is one of them, the troponin increased. I don't see an option where troponin is listed in addition to the CPK-MB. So I don't have that kind of combination. So I know this is one example where the best option will be to select more than one LLT to match my verbatim. The second one was the CPK-MB. So I could put in CPK. I want to show you something, maybe a minor thing, but might as well. The option has a CPK-MB. That's what my verbatim had, CPK-MB. It's going to show me everything with a CPK-MB. Well, what happens if I don't put, and there's 4 of them, what happens if I don't put the dash in? If I just put a CPK with a space MB, I still find the one with the dashes, and I find one with the spaces. So even if your verbatim has a dash, you don't have to put in the dash. MedDRA will still find it for you if it exists. And this is another example where the CPK-MB increased is available here, but only in this order. So even though the verbatim has increased CPK-MB, I don't have an LLT with the word increase in the beginning. I don't have that lexical option, but this is fine. This is CPK-MB increased. So going back to my verbatim, I will need to choose 2 LLTs to be able to accurately match what the report is saying. And some users may ask and say, well, I don't have the option to split code in my organization. That will have to be an internal conversation, because then a decision will need to be made whether to lose the specificity of the lab results that you have, or just to code them to like a cardiac enzyme increase is not really the best option here, because you're losing the specificity that you have in your reported verbatim. So unless it's absolutely impossible to split them, then you start thinking about, what other options may I have internally as an organization. Okay, what about this one? The patient accidentally took drug Y instead of drug X and became short of breath. So the reporter is telling us 2 things. One is that some kind of accidental ingestion of a drug happened because she took or he took a drug Y instead of drug X, and they developed a sequelae to this accidental taking of this drug, which is the shortness of the breath. So when you think about for this particular example, you are absolutely required. You do need to assign more than one LLT because you have a shortness of breath as a medical sequelae, and you also have an error that occurred with the ingestion of the wrong drug. So if we see them in MedDRA, short of breath. So I think the short of breath, I don't know if we have it verbatim. Oh, we do have it verbatim. So we have an exact match for short of breath. We also have increased shortness of breath or shortness of breath or breath shortness. And if you click on all of them, if you expand it, you'll see they all go to the same preferred term. But the closest one to my verbatim is this one, short of breath. And you can see it's a multi-axial preferred term to the respiratory SOC as well as the cardiac SOC, because dyspnea is a common manifestation in heart disease, but the primary site of manifestations is the respiratory, right? So that's why the primary SOC is the respiratory in this example. What about the took the wrong medication? So I don't know if I put the words took and drug, I don't see anything in here. So I know that this was a, how about ingest drug? Okay, so accidental ingestion of drug. Okay, this is close enough where I know it took drug Y instead of drug X, but is this the one that I'm interested in? I'm not 100% sure, because it's an accidental ingestion of drug, but this could mean that they took a drug by accident without meaning to take a drug. My verbatim said it took drug Y instead of drug X, so they intended to take a drug. Is there something better? So how would I look around it? If I right click on this term, it gives me the option to go to browser. And when I click go to browser, basically what this tool is doing is taking me into the hierarchy exactly where this particular term is that I was looking at. It's taking me in that hierarchy, and it highlights it gray. It tells me here's where this particular term exists in the hierarchy that you're interested in. If I expand the PT, I can see different possible LLTs here. So I can see that there was accidental exposure to a drug because of product with I related to device use and all of that, but I'm not 100% sure that this is the right one. What other LLTs are there, right? So if I open up this one, because this is also a medication error, product use error, and issues. So if I'm looking through here and I'm looking for wrong drug, so I see wrong drug, but I don't see wrong drug use. So maybe it's an administration error. So let me open up administration error and look through this one. I see wrong product administered. This seems to be a better option, wrong drug administered. And the reason why I think this is a better option, because my verbatim said the patient accidentally took the drug, which is drug Y, instead of drug X. So how are all these terms different? This has administered in it. So I know that they took it. So it has administered in it rather than just being a wrong drug and rather than being an accidental exposure to product, because I don't know if they meant to take the drug in this particular example here. So this top-down approach, when you're going top-down in here, it really helps you, especially with medication errors and product issues, because there's so many options in MedDRA that maybe if you look through them carefully and you expand and you look through the siblings, the aunts and uncles, the family members of this particular example, its HLTs, its surrounding PTs, you might be able to find a better one. So if we go back to our slide, so for this particular example, I know short of breath had its own LLT, but for this one, I ended up choosing the LLT, wrong drug administered. I thought that was the best in terms of what the source verbatim was. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple more, and then we'll open it up for you guys to test it out on your end. So a 2-day-old baby was noted to have a mild fever. Okay, so if I go into MedDRA and I start over and I look for fever and I look for baby, do I see anything? No, it's telling me there's no combination of fever and baby. Okay, where does fever go? So there's fever. I know that it's PT is pyrexia, and if I click on it, here's the hierarchy. So it goes to body temperature conditions and then general disorders. So I'm wondering, would this PT, or maybe under the HLT, would there be a term closer to what I'm interested in? Is there something like that specific to a baby? So I can right click on the HLT level and I can go to browser. So here's my HLT, febrile disorders, and I can look under my febrile disorders. Is there something here with a fever, but a baby term? So I have, for example, febrile convulsion, febrile infection, neutropenia, fever neonatal. How about fever neonatal? Would that work for my purposes? If I know how old the baby was, and I know what the definition of a neonate was, and if they match each other, then I'm good with this one. So I think neonatal has a cutoff of however many weeks post-birth. If my verbatim said it's within that time period and it's a 2-day-old baby, then yes, my 2-day-old baby can be considered a neonate. So in this particular example, my LLT fever neonatal is a better option. And how are they different from each other? So here's my fever neonatal. When I click on it, I can see that it's multi-axial. So it doesn't just link to the general system organ class under fever, it also links to the pregnancy system organ class as a neonatal fever. So that's why this one is a bit more important for me than just the pyrexia being the standalone fever. When I click on standalone fever, it's a uniaxial term. It just links to the general SOG. So when you're looking in MedDRA, try to see what are the links to this term. Does it Does it go where I expect it to go, or am I missing something? So in my example of 2-day-old baby with a fever, if I just coded fever, I would have lost the ability to also link it to the pregnancy sock, because the neonatal fever is multiaxial. Okay, let's go back to the slides and maybe do a couple more. Okay, 35-year-old woman taking drug X to prevent relapses of multiple sclerosis. So this is interesting because it's taken for the prevention of a relapse. So let me restore defaults. And if I put prevent, just put the word prevent, does it show up anything? Okay, flu prevention goes to antiviral prophylaxis. Prevention goes to prophylaxis. I'm not seeing prevent with multiple sclerosis, but maybe I can use prophylaxis with multiple sclerosis. So let's put prof, mult and sclerose and see if that comes up. So here we go. There's a multiple sclerosis relapse prophylaxis, which really very well fits my example. Of course, it would fit my example because it's an example for you, but it just shows you how to think through it. So if you have prevention and you don't have prevention with multiple sclerosis, see what prevention on its own goes to, which was the prophylaxis, and maybe the prophylaxis is available as a combination with multiple sclerosis. Another example of specific options in MedDRA is pathological fracture of the neck of the femur. So if I go back to my browser and I'm looking for fracture femur. Fracture femur gives me 57 options. And if I expand them and look at all of them, fracture femur has so many different possible locations for the fracture. It could be the head, it could be the shaft, it could be the epiphysis. So let me add neck to my search option and hit it again. So now I only have 14, which is great because now I can really hone in on these 14 and see which one best fits it. So my verbatim said pathological fracture of the neck of the left femur. Now, I don't see left and right, and MedDRA is not going to have laterality. Left and right is not a significant, unique medical concept in MedDRA overall, except for certain situations like the left ventricle and the right ventricle may be really significant because they are separate as unique medical concepts. But left femur from right femur is not a unique medical descriptor. So you're not going to see left and right femur, but I see fractured neck of femur, that goes to femoral neck fracture. And I see pathologic fracture of neck of femur. And if I click on that, it's a different preferred term. It's pathological fracture. So how are these different? If I click on femoral neck fracture, I can see it's multiaxial. The primary sock is injury. The secondary is musculoskeletal. So it takes it to the injury sock because it's a femoral neck fracture. So the assumption here is that something happened, a trauma happened, and they broke their femur. But the pathological fracture, when I click on it, even though it's also multiaxial, it goes primarily to musculoskeletal. There's something already wrong with this particular bone. That's why it broke. It wasn't the trauma. So there's a musculoskeletal condition here from the word pathological. So when you are looking up terms in MedDRA, please be careful what the reporter is saying. This particular reporter is telling us that it was a pathological fracture. That particular type of fracture, no matter what the location, has a separate hierarchy than a standalone fracture. So even though I'm able to code it to the pathological fracture of the neck of the femur, the most important part of this particular term is the fact that it's pathological. It takes it to a different hierarchy. So other examples, following the procedure, the patient experienced several days of constipation. So if we look up constipation in MedDRA, you'll see standalone constipation going to the GI sock. Do I see something that has to do with procedure? Yes, I have post-procedural and post-operative. They both have the same PT. So basically, they both about the same, but they don't go to the gastrointestinal sock as a primary sock. They go to the injury sock as a primary sock because the verbatim specifically says this was as a result of having a procedure. So it came as a post-procedural complication. So if you have a post-procedural constipation and you code it to constipation, you're lumping it with all the other standalone constipations as a GI disorder, when really it's not. It's a post-procedural complication. Okay, so let me go to the next one. And the next one is a 66-year-old man died from a ruptured aortic aneurysm. And the topic of death is always an interesting one. Death tends to be an outcome, right? Just like hospitalization is an outcome. So death doesn't tend to be the standalone verbatim when you're receiving adverse events. And if many places where I worked when they receive death as an adverse event, they query for the cause of death to be reported as the adverse event because the death itself is captured as the outcome. So in MedDRA, we are able to code deaths. So if I just put in death, I am going to see many terms that have death in them. And if I go to the hierarchy to see where the hierarchy takes death terms, they're under the general disorders. So there is death under the general disorders, and some of them have a bit of level of details, like if it's death by homicide or accidental death, right? Or if it is neonatal death. So some of them have a level of detail, but usually death is not expected as a standalone term. In my example said that the patient died from a ruptured aortic aneurysm. So from a MedDRA perspective, if you have the ability to capture the death outside of MedDRA, this can be coded just to the ruptured aortic aneurysm. And we have an LLT in MedDRA for, let's do aortic aneurysm and rupture. Do I have it? I have aortic aneurysm rupture, so I do have it. My verbatim doesn't specify whether it's ascending or whether it's dissecting, so I can't choose these LLTs, even though they go to the same PT, but I want to be as close to my verbatim as possible. So in this particular example, I don't need to map the death separately. I have the cause of death as long as the death is captured elsewhere in its own outcome field. What about when I'm thinking of terms like it was determined the product was counterfeit? So do I have counterfeit terminologies in MedDRA? So here's counterfeit. And what do I get? I get counterfeit drug administered. That's not my report. My report said it was determined the product was counterfeit. I don't even know if the product was a drug, and I don't even know if it was administered. So this is not the right option. I have pharmaceutical product counterfeit. I don't think so, because my source didn't specify this was a pharmaceutical product. If I have a standalone product counterfeit, that would be my best, closest match to my LLT. So again, when you're looking through examples in MedDRA, try to be as close as possible to your verbatim, because there are other options in MedDRA. What about the patient was confined to a wheelchair? Okay, so let's see wheelchair. So let's put wheel with the space and chair and see if it finds it. It will find it, even though the word itself doesn't have a space in it. So I have wheelchair user, and if I click on the hierarchy, I'll see it goes to the social circumstances. So that social circumstances SOC is really interesting because it has so many terminologies in it that can be applicable depending on the social circumstances. So you have disability, you have dietary. So if they're using a special kind of diet, you can actually code that. You have, for example, drug and chemical abuse, educational issues, social issues, even things as funny as hair dye user is available in MedDRA. So take a look sometime at the social circumstances. It's a very unique, very fun kind of system organ class. Other example, the pharmacist made a mistake in compounding the medication. They made a mistake in compounding the medication. So it does tell me there was a mistake, but if I just put medication error, I'm not getting the full detail of what happened with the source verbatim. The source verbatim telling me they made a mistake, but they made a mistake in compounding the medication. So I'm wondering if compounding itself is available. And yes, I have a product compounding error and a product compounding quality issue. So is it a product compounding? They don't go to the same PT, so I know they're separate concepts, but which one matches what I'm trying to code? So my verbatim is that the pharmacist made a mistake in compounding the medication. So it's not a compounding quality issue, it was an error. And does this apply to mine? I mean, my verbatim specifically says it's a medication. Well, let me go back to my concept description, pull up my product. Can I use a product to cover a medication issue? And yes, I can, because product can be used to reflect products such as drugs. So if I use this one, if I use my product preparation error, yes, I can use this one. And if I go to my browser, here are the HLTs that we said can be various HLTs. My category is in preparation. So it's a product preparation error because it's not monitoring, it's not dispensing, it's not a prescribing error, it's a product preparation error. So MedDRA does have a level of detail available to us when we are looking for specific types of product issues and medication errors. So I do encourage you to go to the browser and look through it, top-down approach, and see if you find one that's close as possible to your verbatim. So in summary, when you have a narrative that you're working on, MedDRA will cover most of your narrative. It won't cover the the age, the ethnicity, the type of drug or type of device that they're using, but it will cover indications, it will cover adverse events, it will cover medical history, it will cover social history and risk factors, it will cover surgeries and surgical procedures. So it has a wide scope within MedDRA. Okay, this is the point I think where everybody gets excited about. So we're going to do some coding exercises where you'll be looking in the browser. So please open either the desktop or the web-based browser on your end, whichever one you're familiar with. If you have your own credentials, you can use them. If you don't have your own credentials, the credentials are provided for you in the chat feature. You can go to our website and just click that quick link on the top right-hand corner for WBB to get to the web-based browser. And remember that you can either look from the bottom up or from the top down approach, and please use Poll EV. So this is another reminder of what the Poll EV is, the access to the Poll EV, either the QR code or the URL link, or if you want to go to pollev.com and put in the MedDRA123 as the username. These are all anonymized, so we don't know who's answering what. And here is our first example. She was diagnosed with pneumonia caused by COVID-19 infection. So you're going to ask yourself, what type of term am I receiving? What type of term am I looking at? And is there an LLT in MedDRA that captures all the specifics of this term? So I'll give you guys time to start looking. And if you want to go through the browser and start to find options. So I'm starting to see examples. So COVID-19 pneumonia, COVID-19 pneumonia. Okay, so what does the browser look like? So let me just go to the browser as the answers are coming in. So let's put COVID-19 because I saw that as an option, right? Standalone COVID-19. So there's your COVID-19. This takes you to the infections and infestations as a primary SOC, and it takes you to the respiratory as a secondary SOC under the PT COVID-19. But what about the folks who chose COVID-19 pneumonia? So here's COVID-19 pneumonia. It takes you to a different preferred term. So the COVID-19 pneumonia has its own preferred term, and if you click on it, there's infections and infestations and respiratory. So it's the same two system organ classes, but a different preferred term. And I see answers coming in for novel COVID-19 pneumonia. So if I expand, let's put pneumonia. Let's see how many options I get with just COVID-19 pneumonia. Okay, so if I have novel COVID-19 pneumonia or interstitial pneumonia due to COVID-19 or aggravated or bronchopneumonia, right? These are all going to the same PT. But the level of specificity within the LLT that I choose has to be corroborated or matched by my verbatim. So my verbatim, as you guys see in the poll EV, she was diagnosed with pneumonia caused by COVID-19 infection. The verbatim itself doesn't tell me if it's interstitial pneumonia. It doesn't tell me this is new, this is novel, this is the first time. It doesn't tell me there was an aggravation of the pneumonia, and it doesn't tell me there was bronchopneumonia. So I want to try to pick the LLT that is the closest possible to the verbatim. And in this particular case, it's the COVID-19 pneumonia, right? Because that's the information I have. And thank you all for your options. I'm very happy to see the responses coming in. So yes, you guys are correct. It was COVID-19 pneumonia. Let's do one more. The woman ingested her husband's blood pressure drug by mistake. Now remember, in MedDRA, we don't have specific kinds of medications. So we're not going to see, for example, blood pressure errors or diabetic medication errors. We'll see medication errors or ingestion, drug ingestion. But in this particular example, the woman ingested her husband's blood pressure drug by mistake. So when you think about, medication errors, if you go back to medication errors and the examples that we went through, did she in fact take the medication? Did she ingest it? Was the medication administered? Was it by mistake? Was it done intentionally or not? So things to think about. So I see drug mistake, I see unintended ingestion of product, accidental exposure to product. So a lot of good examples. So let's go to the browser. So I know that she ingested a drug. I know she took it because the verbatim says, so I don't have ingested a drug. Do I have ingested standalone? I don't have ingested standalone. Okay, so let's do ingest. And let's do drug. So accidental ingestion of drug. Okay, so she took the drug. I know she took it because the verbatim says she ingested it. So she wasn't just touching it. She didn't. She actually took it. She actually there was administration of this medication. So I know there was accidental ingestion of the drug, and I know it was accidental because it says in the verbatim she took it by accident. So when you're thinking of the differences between accident and unintended, they're really synonymous, because when you're looking at the preferred term accidental exposure to product, if you see it on my screen, you'll see that accidental ingestion of drug and unintended ingestion of product, they actually go to the same preferred term. Now, if my verbatim mentioned that it was a drug, I prefer to choose the LLT that has the word drug, because I know that the product in my particular example was a drug. So right off the bat, if I have an option between drug and product, I'm going to choose drug just because I have it in my verbatim. It's not going to impact my preferred term in this example, but I have it in my verbatim. If I have by mistake in my verbatim and I have the option between accidental and unintended, it's really the same thing as long as they are taking me to the same preferred term. So in this particular example, because I have the verbatim specifying that it's a drug, then I want to have the LLT specifying it's a drug, and I don't have accidental ingestion or unintended ingestion of drug, so I'd rather pick accidental ingestion of drug. But I want to show you another one kind of in the vicinity of here. The verbatim said the woman ingested her husband's blood pressure drug by mistake. It didn't tell me whether she was an elderly woman. But in MedDRA, the accidental exposure to product by elderly person is a separate PT. So if your verbatim had the elderly woman ingested her husband's blood pressure drug by mistake, then you may be tempted to think of this one as the most or the closest LLT to your verbatim, even though it doesn't have drug. Because in this particular example, if you have, and not all MedDRA terms, we said the age is not a scope within MedDRA, but some medical concept, the age becomes significant. And accidental exposure to product is one of those examples where the age is significant because we have them available for child, and we have them available for elderly, and we have them without an age being defined. So for those of you who selected accidental or unintended ingestion of drug or product, these are all correct. And since we don't have a verbatim, in the verbatim, the age grouping, then we don't choose the one by the elderly. So in this particular example, we said we chose the accidental ingestion of drug because the verbatim has drug and the verbatim has ingestion. So I have them here. I don't have by mistake, but I have accidental. It's a synonym. Unintentional is a synonym, but the combination of these three was closest to my verbatim. It took me to the same preferred term anyway. Here's another one. The patient developed hyponatremia while hospitalized. So they developed hyponatremia while hospitalized. Can we find something that is the closest possible to this verbatim from the browser, with as much information from the verbatim as possible? So can we find that in the browser? Hospital-acquired hyponatremia. Thank you for that option. You see in that option that the spelling of hyponatremia was selected to match the spelling in the verbatim. Incidentally, MedDRA has English in the UK spellings from the PT level and higher, but the American level is found on the LLT. So LLTs, you'll find them in both British English and American English, but PT and higher, you'll find only UK English. Everybody found that one. Everybody found that one. That's awesome. So let's see it in the browser. So I have hospital, I have hyponatremia, and I hit enter, and I have hospital-acquired hyponatremia. So that's where that comes from. And even though that I have both spellings, American and UK, the one in the PT will always be the UK spelling. So if you see that here, the American spelling was only available at the LLT level. Okay, we'll do two more, and then we'll wrap it up. And I'm willing to stay on. I mean, I'm happy to stay on if anybody has questions. So let's do two more and then wrap it up. Nurse noticed that the injection solution had an unusual odor. So the nurse noticed that the injection solution had an unusual odor. I wonder where we can find the best option in our browser for this one. Okay, so when you think about it, maybe the word that you want to start looking at here is the odor, because I know that there's an odor here somewhere. I don't know if I'm going to find injection solution in MedDRA. I mean, MedDRA is not scoped for all different kinds of drugs and all different kinds of modalities, but I have the word odor, so I know there's going to be an odor. I may not have the word unusual in the browser, right? So if I don't have the word unusual in the browser, what's another way that I know this verbatim is telling me? So I have an abnormal odor. And in what spelling is the odor provided to me? Is it in American English or is it in British English? And can I match it? So even to that level, if I can find the LLT that best matches the one in my source, that's the one that I'm going to choose. So I see a lot of product odor abnormal, so thank you for that. And yes, I can choose the product odor abnormal. It has the same spelling as my source. So let me go back to here, restore defaults, and let's just put odor. So standalone odor has 40 different options. I have so many different options for odor, but if I'm not sure where to go to look for more, if I see, for example, application site odor, that's not really what I'm looking for. It's not at a site, but it's a injection solution. I don't have injection or drug or anything like that. I have a product odor abnormal. So if I go here and go to my browser and check for surrounding possible options. So I have a product odor abnormal. I'm going to choose the one here that has the odor with the ODOR because that's what my source said. So even though they both have the same preferred term, I'm always going to try to match my option of LLT as close as possible to my verbatim. And in this particular case, my verbatim has American spelling, so I'm going to choose the American spelling. Okay, let's do the last one. Last asked example, and then I'll open it up for questions and answers. So elderly woman complained her arm was tender where she had received her seasonal flu vaccine. So a lot of information coming my way. Elderly woman complained that her arm was tender where she had received the seasonal flu vaccine. So, okay, there was tenderness in the arm. The tenderness was specifically at the site where she received her seasonal flu vaccine, and this was an elderly woman. This may or may not, the fact that she's an elderly woman may or may not play a part in my LLTs. I may find terms in MedDRA that are impacted by being an elderly, but most are not. And I see options coming in now. So I have injection site tenderness and I have vaccination site tenderness. And it's very interesting that you're picking these. So let's see what the differences are between them. So let's put tenderness and put site. Or let's put tender because my verbatim says her arm was tender. So let's put tender and site. Okay, so I have application site tenderness, catheter site tenderness, implant, incision, infusion, injection site joint tenderness. It's not her joint. The verbatim didn't say joint. So there's injection site tenderness and there's vaccination site tenderness. If I click on injection site tenderness, for example, I see that this is multiaxial, there's a general disorder, and there's an injury disorder, general SOC and injury SOC. But what happens if I expand the vaccination? Where does this one go to? So this also goes in the vaccination to the general disorder SOC and the injury SOC. So it's the same SOCs whether I choose vaccination site or injection site. But what does my verbatim say? My verbatim says that she developed the tender arm at the site where she had received her seasonal flu vaccine. So even though the vaccine is an injection, it's a specific type of injection. So let's keep that part of the detail as received in my verbatim. So when I'm looking at all these options, there are separate preferred terms, so there are separate medical concepts for injection site tenderness versus vaccination site tenderness. But my verbatim specifically mentioned that this happened at the site she received her vaccine, so I can match that level of specificity within my LLT. So when I'm looking at my options, if I progress, then yes, vaccination site tenderness is the one that is closest to my verbatim because I know that it happened at the site of a vaccine. And I chose tenderness even though it routes to the preferred term pain. So even though you're getting to the vaccination site pain anyway, but I didn't choose the LLT with the pain because my verbatim said tender, and I'm trying to be as close as possible to my verbatim. All right, awesome. So we're at the top of the hour. We will wrap up here and say, you know, we went over our summary. We discussed the scope, structure, and characteristics of MedDRA. We discussed the coding conventions. We introduced you to the MedDRA term selection points to consider documents. We went over a demo of the browser. We went over many examples, some of which you did on your own. So I hope you enjoyed this. Here's a list of some useful contacts for you, our email address, our website, our links to our browsers, and if you want to submit change requests or check out our training schedules for the next webinars. I will open it up at this time to Q&A, so those of you who need to drop off because we're done with the 2-hour presentation are welcome to do so. Those of you who have questions, I'm happy to stay on and address. So Hannah, do we have any questions?
Perfect. Our first question asks if the MSSO has any plans to provide a desktop browser that is compatible with Mac.
I don't know the answer to that one. That's a very good question, but we're happy to take it internally and get back to you on that. So Hannah, would you mind getting the information from the end user? And would you know, Hannah, if we do have plans for that?
I am not sure if we have current plans, but I know interest has been expressed before from other users, so we can definitely get back to you via email after talking with our IT team.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Hannah.
Our next question asks if you could please explain again what lexical means.
Sure. So lexical is the order of the words. So if you go to our our browser and just put in, for example, heart failure. And you hit heart failure and you say, I want to look for heart failure. The tool will look for heart failure in the order you put, and it'll tell you, I found the exact match. And it will find it, if it finds it, but not in the order you put, but it finds it where the words are switched in order, it will tell you, I found it as a lexical variant, meaning I found what you're looking for, but not in the same order that you were looking for it. So for example, remember we had one of the examples we were looking for were troponin increased, right? So we were looking for troponin increased, and it found troponin increased. But what happens if we switch them around? So let me look for increased troponin and look for it that way. It couldn't find it directly in the same order, so there was no exact match, but it found it as a lexical variant. So it will tell you, I found it, but not in that same order. So I hope that explains the lexical variants. But if not, please give us a follow-up question.
Our next question asks, with a sequela that occurs, is it preferred to have the clinical site separate the verbatim terms into 2 events so that 2 LLTs can be chosen?
So depending on your sequelae, so I'm assuming that the user posed that question maybe with the examples when we had a medication error plus a sequelae, right? So if that's the part that got you thinking, then yes, the short answer is yes. If you have a medication error reported which led to a medical sequelae, the preferred option is to choose LLTs to reflect both the medication error that occurred as well as the medical sequelae that occurred, and be able to reflect both in your summarization and your tables. So I hope that answered your question. And that also is, there are sections in the PTC document that talks to that as well. So if you want to look up medication errors in the PTC guidelines, as well as the companion document, they have a lot of examples and they speak specifically to that about selecting an LLT for both.
Perfect. Our next question asks, for the death from ruptured aortic aneurysm, would it be suitable to simply indicate death as a seriousness?
That's a good question. So in the terms that have death as an outcome, it really depends on how you design your data collection. You know, how you're building your fields for data collection. If you're collecting death as usually you have it as a series criteria and you have it as an outcome, and then you reconcile the both, right? So you run your edit checks to find if you have an outcome of death but no series criteria, or a series criteria of death but no outcome of death. But if you are building your data collection in a way where you're not capturing death in the outcome field, but only in the series criteria field, and you have a way to capture an outcome of death elsewhere besides the series criteria, that's fine as well. The purpose of that particular example was to showcase that in general, when you have death terms, even though they are codable in MedDRA, please think about them before you just code them in MedDRA, because the expectation is that death itself is not the adverse event. The outcome is the death, but the adverse event would be the cause of death. And if you have a term that has both died due to so-and-so, death due to so-and-so, the cause of the death usually is what gets coded, unless you don't have the ability to capture the death elsewhere, anywhere in your data fields for any reason, then you want to think about splitting them up or selecting more than one LLT to capture both.
Our next question asks, vaccine site tenderness, which SOX is it under?
Okay, so let me show you. Am I still sharing the browser screen, Hannah?
Yes, I'm still seeing the browser.
Okay, so vaccination site tenderness. When you click on a term under your search results, this big panel on the right-hand side populates with all the options that it links to. So if I click on vaccination site tenderness, I can see that there are two main sections that it branches off into. I see the general disorder SOC, and that's the primary one because that has the blue box. But I also saw the injury, poisoning, and procedural complication SOC, and that's your secondary SOC. So when you're running your listings or when you're outputting this particular preferred term, you'll see it under primarily the general system organ class, but you'll be able to retrieve it under the secondary one if you are setting up your data outputs that way, where you show all your SOCs. So I hope that answered that question.
Great. Our next question asks, if a disease and symptoms are entered, would you just code the disease or do you include the symptoms?
So those are very interesting questions. I'm glad you guys are raising those, and a lot of those kind of questions are actually addressed in our advanced MedDRA coding webinar. So please feel free to look up the next offering for the advanced MedDRA coding webinar, and you'll be able to join in for those kind of discussions. So going back to your question, so signs and symptoms plus diagnosis, or signs and symptoms plus a disease. If your signs and symptoms are clearly related to that diagnosis or that disease, then there's no specific need to code them separately, because if they are part of your specific diagnosis or specific disease. So for example, if you are talking about an allergic reaction, and you're talking about itchiness or redness or any of the signs and symptoms that come with an allergic reaction, you just need to code the allergic reaction because those signs and symptoms are related to it. But if you have signs and symptoms that are not related, like somewhere in there you have a within the terminology for allergic reaction, you get something like bleeding or visual disorders or something like that, where you don't expect it to be part of the normal manifestations of an allergic reaction, then it may be information that would be lost to you if you don't capture it separately. And the points to consider document has information about how to approach diagnosis with signs and symptoms. So it's right there. So let's just quickly look it up and take you to that section. So signs and symptoms with a diagnosis, if it's related to that particular diagnosis, then the LLC selected is enough. So chest pain due to myocardial infarction can be coded to myocardial infarction, and that's enough. But if you have signs and symptoms that are not related to your diagnosis, then you want to think about capturing it separately. So I think the example they gave was, is it here? I'm not sure that they gave the example here in this particular section, but if you have a sign and symptom that is not related to your diagnosis, then you have to capture it separately, because that may be something completely separate. And if you don't code it, then you won't be able to retrieve it in your analysis. But if it's related to it, like in this particular example, then no, it's enough. 3.1, I think it's in 3.1, there's more examples. Let me just show you the other examples. If it's provisional, then it's a different approach. Provisional meaning it wasn't confirmed. So if it's a provisional approach, then it's a little bit of a different approach. That if it's a definitive approach with the signs and symptoms, then you only need to code the diagnosis. But if it's a provisional approach, then you want to code the provisional diagnosis, and you have the option of also coding the signs and symptoms. So the PTC document really speaks to all of these kind of scenarios, and if you look through them, I think you have a lot of answers to a lot of the terms that you have trying to code on your end. So I hope I answered that question.
Perfect. And then our last question that we've received is about translations. Who does the translations? Is there a full translation for every language? And are they released along with the international release?
So right now, when you look in the browser, you'll see, and am I on the browser?
Yes.
Am I sharing my browser? Okay. So right now, when you look in the browser, you're going to see about, I think there's 21 right now that have been released already, 21 languages that have been released. The MedDRA files themselves in these 21 languages are complete. Meaning what? Meaning that every single LLT will have a translation. Of course, sometimes in not every possible LLT will have a different translation. So if you go back to hyponatremia, right? Hyponatremia has more than one way to be spelled in British English versus American English. So you have the hyponatremia with the AE and the hyponatremia with the just E. Now, so there's hyponatremia with the AE and hyponatremia with the E. If I choose a different language, if I choose French, and I also choose, let's say, Polish, and I look up hyponatremia. Now I see the hyponatremia with the AE, also with the two languages, the French and the Polish, and I see the hyponatremia with the E, also with the two languages, the French and the Polish. The French and the Polish didn't change because French and Polish don't have UK spelling versus American spelling. So even though the translations are available for all the MedDRA files, there could be certain examples where the translation is duplicated. So in this particular example, the hyponatremia AE in French is the same as the hyponatremia E in French because the French will not have a distinction between AE and E. And if I'm showing you the codes, let me just show you the codes real quick to see the differences here. So the hyponatremia with the AE will have the same numeric code no matter what the language. And the hyponatremia E will have the same code no matter what the language, even though in French the text is the same. But we keep them with separate numeric code because every single term in MedDRA has its own unique code and will have the translation. In terms of documents, not everything will have all the translations. So let me just show you on our website. So here's our website. Here's our training. Here's how to use our support documentation. You can select the language you're interested in here at the top. So if I select Polish, for example, I'm not going to have the points to consider in Polish, right? They're not available. If I'm not going to have the version-specific documents in Polish. So in Polish, it's not available. But if I try, for example, in French, I do have a points to consider in French. It may be a condensed version. It may not be the full version, right? And if I open up the version specific, I do have these version specific documents in French. So depending on the language that you prefer, you may or may not find the full set of documents in that language, and you may or may not find the points to consider as full or as bridged in that language. But the MedDRA files are available complete. So I hope I answered that question.
Wonderful. And that was our last question.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, everyone. Thank you for those who stayed on as we went through our questions. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and speak to you on a coming webinar soon, hopefully.